Hello and welcome to episode 15 of Foreign Correspondence, a podcast about journalists. I'm Jake Spring, a foreign correspondent with more than 8 years' experience in Brazil and China. This week I spoke to Kit Gillet, a freelancer based in Bucharest, Romania. Kit is a big deal freelancer and regularly contributes to the New York Times, The Guardian, and The Economist, writing not only about Romania, but all of Eastern Europe. We know each other from back in China, where he was one of the first journalists I met up with when I returned to China after college, trying to be a freelancer myself. Kit really made me believe that it was possible to make my way as a journalist in China and was very supportive when I was first starting out. He has probably reported from more countries than any journalist I know, reporting from all over Asia, not just China, before he relocated to Romania in 2013. Here he takes us through his career and highlights some of the stories he did in the Philippines about voluntary crucifixion, cockfighting, and people living in a cemetery. Having freelanced full-time for something like 8 years, Kit also has some great insights into the ups and downs of the news as an industry. This is also our 15th episode. I can hardly believe it. I'd like to thank all of our listeners for all the support getting the podcast off the ground and listening episode after episode. Also, thanks to all of my guests for trusting me in an untested project. I'm sure there will be dozens of episodes to come. We're still in early days. But we'll start to see some changes as I get into uncharted territory, interviewing people I know a bit less well as I talk to people in new countries and at new publications. If you would like to nominate anyone you think would make for an interesting interview, email me at foreignpod@gmail.com. That said, when this episode comes out early Sunday morning, I'll be on a plane somewhere over the Atlantic Ocean on my way to Spain for 2 weeks to report on COP25, the United Nations Climate Conference. I will cover the negotiations over how to implement the Paris Agreement, the principal structure for countries to confront climate change. I plan to keep a particular eye on Brazil and China because I speak their languages, but it's also a tremendous opportunity to stretch my legs as a reporter and try something new covering the conference overall. So the podcast will be going on a hiatus to allow me to focus on this reporting trip. We'll take a break through the holidays and return in January. Rest assured, this is a temporary break. I already have an interview recorded with someone in Africa. Stay tuned for more details on that. And I'm arranging some others. Keep an eye on our Twitter account @foreignpod or watch facebook.com/foreignpod for more about our return in January. And if you want to follow my reporting from the UN Climate Conference in Madrid, my handle on Twitter is @JakeSpring. Okay, now on to the episode. I'm very pleased with how this turned out, and I think it's a fitting one for the 15th episode milestone. Here it is, my conversation with Kit Gillet, a freelancer in Romania for the New York Times and many others. Okay, I'm talking to Kit Gillet, a freelancer based in Romania. Thanks a lot for making the time to talk to me, Kit.
You're very welcome.
If you could just describe where you are, what time it is, your surroundings, and what kind of work week you've had.
Well, you've caught me at a good moment. Right now I'm sitting in the courtyard of a very picturesque old villa in a second-tier Romanian city called Turda. Normally I'm based in Bucharest, which is a heavy, polluting kind of metropolis. But I'm actually attending a journalist workshop this weekend. I'm doing a couple of panels. And so you've caught me on a very nice day where I'm trying to basically start my weekend a little bit early. It's been a good week. I've been pretty busy filing some articles that were overdue or just about due. And I've got one more that I'd like to finish this week. But if I don't finish it, I'm sure the editor won't be too annoyed.
So it's a workshop for Romanian journalists, I imagine?
The place I'm in is the former home of Romanian diplomat, and after the country kind of turned communist, he was outside in London, and he was part of the kind of outside community trying to keep Romania in the news and trying to get help to communist Romania, or, trying to help those fighting to get it back into a more democratic path. So this workshop is part of, an attempt to help kind of form a stronger journalistic community here in Romania. There are some amazing journalists here, but journalism is underfunded everywhere, and in Romania it's particularly so. So this workshop is bringing up some foreign correspondents and foreign editors who are going to give some advice, going to give some feedback on reporting on global events and delving into the dark spaces of journalism. So there's an editor from the FT here and someone from the AP and myself, an editor from Hungary as well, and a very good investigative Romanian journalist. I think we're the main panelists over this weekend, are hopefully going to prove to be valuable sources of information.
And then the idea is to know how you got to where you are now, going way, way back to where were you born and what was it like growing up there?
First, I'm quite curious to know if you found during your, dozen or more episodes that you've filmed so far, whether there's quite an even split between those who are very clear on the path they wanted to take into journalism and the more accidental journalists. I'm very much in the latter category, you might say, but I'm curious if you're finding quite an interesting split.
Yeah, I would say, especially since I went to university where there was a big journalism school, the people who went to the journalism school usually, they knew in high school they wanted to be journalists, which I consider pretty early. But then, some others accidentally got into it, which, I'd say it's pretty even, which is surprising considering when I graduated, it was so hard to get into journalism because of the financial crisis. But a lot of people still ended up there, even if they didn't mean to.
So I was born in England, obviously, and the south coast, near a town called Hastings. I'm actually from a little village that's called Battle, where, for history buffs, it's where the Battle of Hastings happened 1,000 years ago. So I grew up in the UK, went to university and studied English language and ancient history. And I liked the idea of journalism, but I also liked the idea of archaeology and things that allowed me to delve into stories, really. So I didn't do student journalism. When I was at high school, I did a week or so at a local paper, but that was more kind of curiosity. I never wrote a single article for my university student newspaper. I didn't have that drive. I never wanted to go into a newspaper in London and start from the ground up. So the only thing that was really clear to me was I wanted to leave the UK. Not that I didn't like the place, it's just that after I'd finished university, I'd already spent 21 years in the country and I felt that was probably enough for now. And so I graduated university and pretty much left the country. I got a teaching English qualification, like a month-long course, just to give myself the ability, if needed, to earn money as I wandered. And then very shortly after I left university, which was in 2004, the tsunami happened. So the tsunami that hit Thailand, hit Sri Lanka, and caused widespread devastation. And I ended up basically going to work for an NGO in Sri Lanka that was rebuilding houses that had been destroyed by the tsunami. So very shortly after the tsunami, I was in a very rural area of Sri Lanka helping to build these houses. Now, this was comparatively a fortunate area of the country. This was on the west coast where people had managed to flee. There hadn't been much death. Not many families had lost loved ones, but most families had lost their homes, their possessions, their documents, their everything. So, I've spent, can't remember how long exactly, a bit less than a year in this community building houses. And that started my journey in Asia. And then from there, I moved to Vietnam and spent basically a year living in Saigon, in Ho Chi Minh City, in southern Vietnam. And there I was doing some English teaching to pay the bills. That's when I did my first real bit of writing. And I was doing some volunteer work at a UNICEF halfway house for street children. And from there, I moved to China. And that's when my journalist career began, really.
Sure. Wow. So you went straight from the UK to Sri Lanka. You somehow found that job and they sent you over there?
Pretty much. I moved to Spain for about 2.5 weeks, but that doesn't really count. I moved there, started looking around for a teaching job or something, and then got very impatient and realized that maybe I wanted to go further afield than Europe. And so I went back to the UK and actually got offered a job like a day after I'd got back to the UK. So that could have been a very different path taken. And then, the tsunami happened, and through roundabout means I managed to get this opportunity that took me to Asia, and then I would spend the next decade living in Asia.
In the US, somebody moving and living abroad is viewed as a quite weird thing, and parents often think it's strange. In the UK, I get the sense because it's a much smaller country, it's not necessarily that strange, but what was your family like, and how did they react to you wanting to go and live abroad and get out of the UK?
My dad's now retired, but he was a high school English teacher. My mum was is still really a social worker and a family therapist. So no journalism there, although my dad has published some books on the area around where I was born using old postcards and photographs to look back into the history that way. But regarding me running away from home as such, I think I had long prepared for it. From the age of 10 or 11, it was very clear that I was going to spend parts of my life overseas. You know, I have older siblings. I have one older sister and then some stepbrothers and sisters, and several of those had spent time abroad, a year or so, traveling or doing ski seasons. So living abroad for short periods of time was quite normal for my family, not quite to the degree that I've taken it.
Gotcha. And it sounds like if you were finished up by 21, you didn't take a gap year or anything. So did you have much experience abroad? Did you have any concept of what Vietnam was like, for example, or was it more just like you were abroad, you heard about it, you thought, why not move there?
So from an early age, I'd travelled on holidays. My mum did the brilliant thing of when the Berlin Wall fell, she took me and my sister out of school that following Easter, so Easter 1990, and basically took us for a month around some of Eastern Europe because she wanted us to see it before it changed too much. So we went to Poland, Czechoslovakia as it was then, and Hungary. So over 2 summers we spent a month wandering around these countries. They were still right in the throes of the end of communism, the start of a market economy and the return of democracy. So I think that, and then obviously many subsequent trips, got my interest in the world heavily stoked. Regarding, sorry, I've forgotten the second half of your question.
Just how you got from Sri Lanka to Vietnam, if you'd say never been there before, what made you decide to do that?
So after spending that time in Sri Lanka, this was right at the point before the civil war kicked off again, but things were even at that point getting a bit sensitive and dicey. And I decided at that point to move on. Now, actually, I had a friend of my sister's was working in a school. She was an English teacher in a school in Saigon. And so she suggested I apply to that school, which seemed like a good idea. And I've always been a big history person. I've always studied history and reading history books and exploring history. So for me, again, the Vietnam War was a period that I was very interested in academically. And so I felt, yes, Vietnam would be a very interesting place to spend some time.
You said that's where you did your first bit of journalism, is that right? And just what was it, out of curiosity?
It would have been listings, magazines, basically, local publications like Film Review or event stuff. It was very uninspiring and very uninteresting stuff. I can't quite even remember what those first things were. But again, it wasn't what I was doing in Vietnam. It was very much just something on the side. Someone asked me to do it and I said, why not? It was when I got to China that I seriously focused and seriously decided that a journalist was what I wanted to be, and journalism was where I wanted to spend my life, really.
So describe how you got to China then, and what was the thing that triggered you to realize that journalism was what you wanted to do?
I arrived in China in mid-2006. This was at the point where the country was gearing up for the Beijing Olympics in 2008, and it was very clear that the world's attention was on China more than ever at that point. And so I was very interested in it and felt there were a lot of stories to do, and it was a very interesting place. I actually arrived in China by bus. So I took the bus, a little cramped little minivan from Hanoi, across the border. I think it was $6 it cost me to cross to the border and stop in the nearest city on the Chinese side. A couple of days before I arrived, I went on a website and applied for an English language job in Nanning, the city, and got it pretty much straight away. So by the time I got off the bus, someone picked me up at the bus stop and took me to some accommodation, and I spent my first 7-8 weeks in China living in Nanning, learning some of the language and just getting a bit acclimatized. You know, I was never actually planning to spend much time there, but the idea was I didn't want to go straight from Hanoi to Beijing. I wanted to suss out a little bit and maybe have a chance to learn a bit of the language and just get a little bit of an understanding before kind of delving into a city like Beijing. And after 7-8 weeks, I took another bus to Hong Kong, picked up an F visa, a 6-month visa, and headed to Beijing. And again, when I first arrived, I did a little bit of English teaching to pay the bills, but was very much at that point looking for writing opportunities. And at that point, there were actually some very good listings magazines in the city that still exist today. So quickly I started doing, again, some film reviews, book reviews, and then I started doing some architecture pieces around the new Olympic stadiums where I would find a way to talk to the right people so I could go with an architect into the stadiums before they were finished, or into the water cube, and kind of write some longer features on those. And yeah, that's when I really kind of started doing journalism, really started pursuing it properly.
What set that off was just the few things you had done in Vietnam that was enough for you to realize this is what I really want to do?
It was more that I love stories. It's as simple as that. I'm one of these journalists that the writing part is very secondary. It can be very laborious, and it's not the enjoyable part of being a journalist. The enjoyable part is the ability to wander up to anyone I like, really, and ask them the questions I want to ask and have them answer them. And that never gets tiring. And that's an amazing thing for a curious person to be able to do that. And that is really what I love about journalism, that ability to go into different environments, into places that are not familiar to me. And again, that's a big part of foreign correspondency. You're in alien places for you, and being able to talk to people to try and understand their world. And that's really what drew me into journalism.
Sure. Yeah, I totally agree that I'm definitely more into the reporting part and then talking to people part than I am into the writing part. So you were in Beijing starting from 2006. So you must have been there quite a while. And were you a freelancer the whole time? Did you do some full-time jobs at any point?
So I arrived in mid-2006. And as I said, I was doing a bit of English language teaching, but increasingly doing journalism. And actually very shortly after arriving, I got hired to write some guidebooks. So I worked for this company that would produce guidebooks for smaller Chinese places, cities or areas that are not particularly well known. The idea being that this company would be paid by the local governments to make them a guidebook in English they could then use to promote their area. So I think I have the dubious distinction of having written the guidebook that managed to go out of date the quickest of any guidebook in the world ever, I imagine, because one of the books I co-wrote it, was on a place called Dujiangyan in Sichuan in southern China. And it's a beautiful area. I spent, 3 or 4 weeks there, and we wrote this very interesting book. But the book came out, and then I think about 3 weeks later, the Sichuan earthquake hit. The earthquake hit about 50 kilometers away from where this city was, where this area was. And so half of what I wrote about ceased to exist 3 weeks later, which was obviously very devastating for the region, but also meant the book was pretty useless except for a historical relic. And then after that, in a quite fortunate way, there was a business magazine in Beijing called China International Business, and they had this idea, very brief idea, that they would write these travel guides, little kind of inserts to their business magazine, offering advice for foreign business travelers going to, again, second tier or third tier Chinese cities. So, you're talking Americans coming over to open a toothpaste factory in Anhui province, and these inserts could give them quite valuable advice on just what to see in the cities, what to do. It was a very short-lived idea they had. I think we ended up doing 2 of them. But at that stage, they'd signed me as a staff writer at the beginning of this process with the idea that I would devote half my time to those and half my time to the business magazine. And I very quickly knew I didn't want to do those guides. I wanted to concentrate on the business magazine anyway. So I wasn't at all sad when those guides were deemed not so profitable. And then I was left to be on staff at the business magazine. So I gave myself a crash course in writing about economics and business and finance because I'd not had that experience. And then I spent 2.5 years working for this business magazine out of Beijing that was covering all things China, and it was English language. And yeah, I started off as the junior person, and by the end I was basically the co-editor. 2 of us ran the magazine by the end. And it was great. We were a small team, and it was a monthly magazine. So I got to experience the whole evolution of a monthly magazine. So I was involved right from commissioning to writing sections of it, to editing, to layout, to choosing photos and fonts and headlines, and then dealing with the digitals. And so it was a real learning experience. And then at the end of that, at that point, I was feeling ready to go freelance. And then
Does that take us through the Olympics, or?
That takes us through the Olympics, yes. So I joined that business magazine at the very end of 2007, very beginning of 2008. And I was with it through the Olympics and then up to basically 2010. And yes, it took us to the Olympics, but more interestingly, it was for a business reporting side. I joined, and then, shortly after the Lehman Brothers, Bear Stearns, the financial crisis began in the West, China injected huge amounts of money, hundreds of billions of dollars into the economy. So suddenly there were all these amazing infrastructure projects happening and all this money that China was spending. I think it was almost $700 billion that they were spending to make sure that the financial crisis didn't heavily impact China. And so I was vicariously along for that ride, which was a very fascinating time to cover business in China. And then just when I was feeling like I wanted to go freelance and have a bit more ability to wander, the South China Morning Post came knocking, and they basically offered me a job as a features writer in their Beijing bureau. And I got offered this opportunity, and it was one that I didn't feel I should pass up. So then for a while I joined the South China Morning Post. The idea was to write features and longer form and colourful kind of pieces from China to go nicely with their more daily news.
And you found transitioning between feature writing and business writing, did you have a preference? Did you like doing them both?
I did. And in fairness, I still do them both. But in the end, the South China Morning Post job wasn't quite. I arrived at a kind of a bit of a transitional point for the publication. They brought in some outside editors, I think, from the Wall Street Journal. And I'd been brought in by the new team as part of this attempt to move the publication in a slightly different way. And there was quite a lot of pushback from some of those who'd been at the publication for a long time. And in the end, most of those editors left, and that path was kind of reversed. So in the end, I didn't do as much features writing. It was a lot more daily writing that I ended up doing and fitting in features where I could. But it was still a fascinating time. This was around the time of Liu Xiaobo's detention and arrest and imprisonment. And it was really, again, a fascinating time. China, as you know, is always a fascinating story. It's incredible how much you could write about the country and never run out of stories.
Yeah, definitely. There's no lack of things going on, whether it's booming or whether now the economy's slowing down. This takes me through, I was doing some deep Gmail research to try to figure out who put me in touch with you first, because we first got in touch in 2009, but then in 2011 again, and I realized I don't think either of us remembered the second time I got in touch with you. So the first time I got in touch, you must have been working at China Business International, it is, right?
China International Business, yeah.
China International Business. Dave Green, who I knew from Asia Weekly and who's been working journalism jobs around Asia for a long time, put me in touch with you. And I think you said, we're only looking for interns. We're not looking for full-time people. And I said, okay, and moved on. But then 2 years later, when I actually did move to China without a job, just with some money in my pocket, Alexandra Stevenson had put me in touch with you. So I emailed you again, not mentioning at all that we had been in touch before. And that's when we met up. And I remember meeting you in a cafe. And if it was 2011, I had thought you were freelancing.
I probably would have been at the South China Morning Post. But I think I would probably still been at the South China Morning Post. I left right at the end of that year. But yeah,
okay, sure.
So, you were at Asia Weekly for a while with Alex and with Tom McKenzie and Mitch Moxley and that crew, weren't you? Because people at Asia Weekly have gone on to some impressive careers. Alex is in Beijing with the New York Times, and Tom McKenzie's Bloomberg TV in Beijing, and Mitch was executive editor at Maxim for a while and is now holding a similar role at a Dow Jones publication in New York. So that Asia Weekly crowd that you were part of, the people who've gone on to have some very impressive journalistic careers.
Yeah, definitely. I was an intern at Asia Weekly, so I wasn't there that long. I was actually the intern the summer of the Olympics, and I believe Alex was interning at that point too. She might have stuck around longer. I can't quite remember. So I predate Mitch, although me and Mitch do cross paths a bit later on. And yeah, I remember that's where I met Dave, who had also put me in touch with you. And I remember it being a very invigorating experience. It was my first time really working as a journalist besides as a student journalist. And it was run by this kind of eccentric publisher who wasn't very good at managing the business side, honestly, I think we can all say. And so when the magazine folded, I think it actually turned out well because everybody spread out and kind of got after it and, pursued the next thing, and everybody ended up at good places.
It was also just an incredible time to be a journalist in China those years leading up to the Olympics, and then after that to the Expo in Shanghai. It was such a great time for those who didn't want to necessarily do the step of working, making the coffee on Fleet Street or in New York, and then slowly working up and spending 4 or 5 years getting onto the metro desks, and then another 4 or 5 years until they got the chance of having a foreign posting. Going to China at that point was a real way of skipping some rungs in the ladder if you had the get up and go. And there were so many freelancers from that period who were ambitious and who were driven and saw that China was this incredible story, and that because of the language and because of the distance and because it seemed so alien to so many people, that there was just this demand for China stories that wasn't being met. And that was incredible for young freelancers like myself and like yourself and many of those who were around us at the time.
And it was also loose on the visas. Everyone was on the 3-6 month visas going in and out of the country. And especially with the Olympics and everything, the government was turning a blind eye to it. Through most of my time they were. It was only in the last couple of years that they began to tighten up on that. For me, it was definitely circumventing the financial crisis in the U.S. because I graduated in 2009. The journalism scene was a bit depressing in the U.S. at the time. And in China, it's like nothing had happened, just like you said. Things went on as usual. So, I remember meeting you in the back of a cafe. Maybe you were at the South China Morning Post at that point. Maybe you weren't. I remember you were trying to bash out some sort of banking report that somebody had browbeaten you into doing. You basically said that you kept saying you didn't want to do it, and they kept offering you more money, so you decided you couldn't pass it up. But you basically described what you just described to me, this demand for stories like that, this big freelance scene. And I remember I also got coffee with Mitch Moxley, and he had just gotten his book deal, and all this just sounded amazing to me. And I was like, wow, this is where it's at, freelance and write books. And if you have the motivation and you're willing to take the risk and move here, then you can really make it happen. That was maybe a little bit naive, but it was enough to make me think I can really do this. Yeah, definitely.
Naivety, don't underestimate naivety. It's very useful at times. The amount of time foreign journalists have very naively leapt into a situation, and things can go wrong, but it gets some incredible stories by just being naive and just going for it.
Definitely. There were some periods I freelanced, but I quickly ran out of money after meeting you and Mitch and got a job in Shanghai at China Economic Review, which slightly different format, but probably similar to your experience at China International Business. And also in 2 years, I ended up as the editor-in-chief, which, that's the kind of stuff that, only happened in China, that you could be in your mid-20s and be a big editor at some publication.
It was a wonderful experience. And as a freelancer now, the fact that I have this business and economic writing background is incredibly useful, because most journalists can write news stories, they can write spot news. It's these kind of niche areas, if you're a freelancer, that are really valuable, because there is always demand for those kinds of articles, and they normally pay a bit more. And having that experience is, I didn't think about it at the time when I was in China. I just got offered an interesting job that I thought would be a good way of starting my journalist career properly. But in hindsight, it's been very useful as a skill set that I learned.
So you finish up at South China Morning Post and you go freelance full-time. How long did you do that in China, and at what point do you start getting bigger commissions for international publications?
I was lucky at the business magazine. They were okay with us freelancing. We were all ambitious journalists in our 20s or early 30s. And to stop us leaving to pursue other things, they were happy for us to freelance as long as we kept our day jobs and it didn't impinge on our work. And so even when I was at the business magazine, I had bylines in Foreign Policy, in The Guardian, in Forbes magazine Asia, and maybe the Toronto Star and the Sydney Morning Herald, so these kinds of publications. So I had already started freelancing while having a staff job. And then when I joined the South China Morning Post, I wasn't allowed to do that. So I didn't freelance for that time. But I was itching to travel. At that point, all my journalism had been in China, and I was very curious about the rest of Asia. I'd been on holidays to a few places, but I wanted to explore. And I had some friends who were photographers, and we started planning some trips up to Mongolia and in various other places. And, I was surrounded by quite inspiring people that were constantly on the move. People like Adam Dean, who's the New York Times' photographer for Southeast Asia now, and he was constantly off to Myanmar or off to Thailand to cover coups and military uprisings. And so at the end of my time at the South China Morning Post, I was already kind of looking to really embrace freelancing. And again, I was very lucky to have quite inspiring people around me. At that point, I was living actually next door to Jonah Kessel, who's now the director of cinematography at the New York Times. But at that point, he had been dealing with the revamp of the China Daily, and he was looking to go into video work. And so the two of us started plotting some videos that we wanted to do together, and we ended up doing half a dozen videos together, starting just in our neighborhoods, some pieces on the hutongs, the alleyways of old Beijing, and then we did some pieces up in Mongolia. We followed Jane Goodall around for a couple of days, and we did some interesting pieces together before he then went on to greatness with the Times.
I know Jonah not very well.
So I basically left the South China Morning Post. I probably left the South China Morning Post on a Friday, and on the Monday I was on a bus to Mongolia. And straight away I started doing these long trips where I'd go with a photographer and spend 3 or 4 weeks in a country, and planned it in advance and do maybe 8 stories in that time. So we would have pre-sold 4 or 5, and there'd be a travel story in there, and then a profile of someone interesting, whether it's the Mongolian poet laureate or whether it's an interesting politician, or in the case of Cambodia, a Vietnamese or a war photographer who can't leave the place really because friends of his died and he's still searching for their remains. And then amongst those, there would also be a couple of maybe environmental features and some hard political news if that was happening at the time. So I very quickly kind of transitioned into freelancing and really doing a whole range of different work for different kind of publications. Because again, I was finding for many countries in Asia, there wasn't much coverage. It's obviously a big sadness that newspapers are going through such struggles. And one of the big places that gets cut is foreign bureaus and foreign reporting. So nowadays, very few publications have foreign staff, and that's bad for coverage. But if you're young, again, if you're a freelancer, that does lead to opportunities. If you're a self-starter and if you suddenly contact an editor and say, I'm in Mongolia and I have these story ideas, chances are they've not had a story from Mongolia for 6 months or a year, and they're pretty happy to diversify what they've been covering.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, a lot of publications outside of China have very sparse staffing. I know like AP's cut way back in a lot of services. But anyway, so you do that for a few years. And then when is it that you moved to Romania?
So I moved to Romania in mid to late 2013. So, at that stage, I'd been based in China for 6.5 years. And it's an amazing, fascinating place, China. And it's incredible, and there are so many stories, but as I'm sure you can also attest, it wears you down. Being a journalist in China is not that easy. There are hassles, there are problems, there are stories that you find it very hard to cover. It's frustrating that you can never talk to officials, and it's hard. Also, the pollution is bad for 5 months in winter. So after 6.5 years there, I was feeling burnt out. I was feeling like I needed a change. And my then girlfriend, now wife, I started telling her that I needed a break from China. We'd met there, and I was kind of suggesting maybe we try somewhere else for a period. The idea was just to move somewhere for maybe a year or even 6 months and then come back to China, because we were both heavily tied to the country. And she's Romanian, and we started looking around at options. And there was a Chinese company that was building the largest solar power plant in Romania at the time, and they were looking for someone in that industry, which my now wife is in that industry and was then. And they were looking for someone who could speak English, Chinese, Romanian, and knew the industry, and that was basically her. So we talked about it, and again, for me, I was quite fascinated. I didn't know too much about Romania. I had not been before, but the region fascinated me for a while, since visiting, Czechoslovakia and Poland in 1990. And I became aware of foreign news in the world in a way at the time of the Bosnian War and the wars in ex-Yugoslavia. So I was quite fascinated to try living in this part part of the world. So we came, and the idea was that we would spend 9 months, a year here, and then the solar park would be finished, and we would then return to China or maybe Hong Kong or Taiwan or somewhere. And then never quite happened. They wanted her to stay on. They had other projects. They had issues with the park, with the regulatory environment, and they needed someone to manage it, and she was interested in doing that, and I took a little bit of time, but I'd kind of started to establish myself in the region, and there were some fascinating stories happening. And so we just kept extending, and, now it's been, 6 years now, and I'm still fascinated by this region.
Yeah, it must have been quite the transition, because, you had figured things out very, very well back in China. It sounds like it took a little bit to adjust to Romania, but at the same time, I would imagine Romania, like you said, it's not like lots of places have people based there. So I imagine you can be the guy in Romania for a lot of different publications. So how did you find the transition?
I was very lucky in the sense that I had these relationships with editors from quite a few prominent publications in the West. And I also had friends who worked for the New York Times who, I'd done some pieces for the New York Times, but not from China because they have their strict visa issues. So I'd done pieces for the New York Times from Mongolia and from Vietnam. But when I moved to Romania, I reached out to my editors who I had a decent relationship with, and to friends who worked for different publications, and said, can you put me in touch with the relevant editor, the Europe editor? Can you put in a good word for me? Or can you just, introduce? And so my first month or two in Romania was a lot of talking to the Europe editors at all those publications. I'd been doing stuff for the Economist in China, and so I was then suddenly needing to build a relationship with the Europe editor, and the same with the New York Times and the Christian Science Monitor and the Guardian and all the publications that I'd been doing little bits for from various places in Asia. I was now still wanting to work for them. It was just transitioning to new editors and building those new relationships. And that took a bit of time, and also just understanding what was happening in the region. So understanding what were interesting Romania stories, but also interesting Bulgaria stories and Moldova stories and Serbia stories and Kosovo stories. And yeah, it took a little bit of time, but also I arrived at a very interesting time for the news, because maybe in my first year there was the big protests in Turkey. I didn't actually go to those, the Gezi Park ones, but when Maidan happened in Ukraine, Christian Science Monitor sent me there. So I ended up spending quite a bit of time covering Maidan in Ukraine and the protests there, and doing stuff at Al Jazeera as well from there. And
remind me what Maidan was.
It was the big uprising in Ukraine in 2014, where people took to the street despite it being freezing conditions, and basically occupied the centre of the city and overthrew the government, really. And there's a lot more to it than that, but these protests lasted for quite a long time, and in the end there were people shot and killed. There was quite a few clashes between the security forces and the protesters, and it got quite violent at times, but it was a very important story back in 2014 at that time. And then for Romania, the political situation got really, really intense in 2015 with huge protests, and the political uncertainty and chaos has basically been at the heart of Romanian issues for the last 4 years. And that's given me, again, a huge amount of work. I do a lot for the New York Times. That's probably my main publication at the moment, and for the last couple of years. But there was a period where there were massive protests, and, every day I was having to decide almost who I was working for that day, whether it was the Guardian, the New York Times, the Economist. It was a pretty intense period for about 3 weeks where it was really hard to almost not let people down. There was so much demand. But that's obviously extremely rare for a country like Romania, which most of the time is kind of out of the news.
Sure, yeah. But wow, like having all those places knocking on your door, wanting you to report, is, even if it's a short time, it's kind of a freelancer's dream, I imagine. But stressful too, I know.
I've been very lucky, both with my timing. I've arrived in this region at a very interesting point. So I was in Greece during the financial crisis there. I've been across lots of countries. I've been sent to various countries by publications. And this region is fascinating. And there are not many people based here. There isn't a foreign correspondence club of Romania, because there aren't foreign correspondents in Romania except for me and one or two others. And it's the same across the region. The big Western publications, the Guardian, the New York Times and the Washington Post, these places do not have anyone between Warsaw, Budapest and Athens. So if you're willing to be here and work for multiple different publications. It's more than full-time work.
Sure. There's your advert for young freelancers who I'm sure are not thinking about Romania. I would be curious to know where...
That would be my advice. My advice to young freelancers is go somewhere other people are not. It's fascinating. And a lot of times I actually contact editors and they don't know what's happening in Romania. They literally say, what's interesting in Romania? We haven't had a Romania story for a year or two. And they're very open to hearing ideas. I'm in a fortunate position. I get to write maybe 2 stories for the New York Times every month, perhaps 1 or 2, and similar for other publications. But there are a lot of other publications I work for. I did a piece for The Atlantic earlier this year from Moldova. And I think that's probably the first Moldova story The Atlantic's had for about 5-10 years. And so by being in a place that is off the radar, if you've got a good sense for what makes the story and you have a bit of experience, you can show a few clippings. There really is a lot of opportunities.
Definitely. I would be curious to know what locations are magneting in journalists these days, because I feel like China's kind of cooled off because of how difficult it is to get a visa there these days and cracking down on that. So I wonder where everybody's headed.
I don't know is a simple answer. There are pockets in Europe, places where there are small pockets of journalists. Places like Belgrade still have a little press pool, and Warsaw and Budapest, these hubs, especially the hubs that have good, cheap, low-cost flight bases so that the journalists can bounce around the region. They're hubs, and I think Bangkok is probably similar with the Myanmar story and with interesting things happening in that region and cost of living. I think you'll find that's still a hub. But yeah, it would be interesting to know. Back in 2006, 2008, it felt like China was the one to go to if you were ambitious and young and were able to relocate to a strange new world. I'm not sure where that is nowadays.
Yeah, me neither. Okay. So one question I wanted to ask, because when we were setting this up, you had quite like, if you don't want to be interrupted, it should be 9 to 5. And I thought that was interesting coming from a freelancer. And I was just curious if you keep, as a freelancer, in order to keep your sanity, like very set work hours in order to maintain a division between your personal life and work.
Not at all, no. I'm constantly working until 1 a.m., 2 a.m. in the morning. No, the issue with that was that I have a 3.5-year-old daughter. And while she can be kept away from rooms for a period of time to allow me to record, I was thinking an hour or 2-hour chat might be beyond her abilities to stay quiet, to stay, occupied elsewhere in the house. So I do quite a lot of radio and TV kind of spot news. Like if there's an event again happening in Romania or in the region, like I'll often get called up by the BBC or by France 24 or Al Jazeera or Deutsche Welle or places to discuss things. And my constant fear is always that my daughter will suddenly appear in the back of the screen or will decide that she needs to talk to me. So no, the idea, I just suggested a daytime hours just because that would be when I could guarantee peace and quiet to have this nice long chat.
Gotcha. So in terms of work-life balance, it's still kind of work all the time, on demand, that sort of thing?
Yes, I love being a journalist, and that's almost as simple as that. And I have a difficulty saying no to interesting work. And so pretty much always have too much work on. There's never a moment where I don't have 6 or 7 articles on the go that I'm drastically trying to work my way through with varying deadlines. So no, my work-life balance is not particularly balanced, just because I do struggle to say no to editors I like or to interesting projects. And outside of family time, I tend to let that dominate my life, probably a bit too much for my own well-being.
Well, yeah, I think it's fairly common among freelancers. I remember, I say I kind of knew Jonah because I remember he took a month off or something and we hung out a couple times. But then when he was working, it was just impossible to hang out with him. He just was too busy.
I've done work with Jonah where the two of us, I remember once we were doing some videos for Save the Children, actually. The deadline was ridiculous. I think the idea was, there were 5, 6 or 7 minute video profiles of different people who had disabilities who were being helped by Save the Children or had managed to reach a stage where they were quite self-sufficient. And we had to travel across 5 different locations in China to cover this. And I seem to recall us having about a week to put all these videos together. And I was literally living in his studio for a week and just ordering in food and then sleeping on the floor. He would barely sleep, and I'd kind of grab a 2-hour nap, wake up, and he would still be sitting there editing with all the videos kind of being formatted on the screen. When he works, that man is a demon.
Yeah. I guess before we run too long, we should get into some stories. And I like to start with, rather than ending on a down note, start with the story that got away, a story that you wanted to do, but it didn't come off for whatever reason. Either you couldn't sell an editor on it, you couldn't prove it, a reporting trip that went horribly wrong, what have you. Does anything come to mind?
Yeah, there's a couple of stories that got away from me just because, as I said, I used to do these trips where I'd go away for 3 weeks, 4 weeks and pick up 7 or 8 stories, and had pre-sold some, but some were on spec. And there were a few times where there were stories that I thought really good that I was trying out that didn't quite work. There's one story that I'm still quite sad that I didn't do, mostly because I did do the story. I actually had it all. I get my act together and sell it, really. So just before I moved to Romania, I did a reporting trip in Cambodia and popped back over to Vietnam for a brief bit for about 5 days. And I had this idea of doing a story about the Vietnamese offspring of some of the American soldiers from the Vietnam War. And so there was a photographer I knew who had done some work on this already. And so he'd put me in touch with the fixer that he'd been using down there. And I basically went and spent 5 days going around interviewing these men and women who were now obviously in their, let me do the math, in their 40s, who were visibly not just Vietnamese. These were people whose fathers had been African American GIs or their fathers had been Caucasian, and they look quite different. And because of that, they had been heavily stigmatized in the 80s and 90s. Their childhoods were heavily influenced by their fathers, who had obviously gone back to the US. But these children had grown up at a point where America was the demon that had been defeated by the North Vietnamese, and that these children were kind of left behind and they got bullied. Most of them were not really in formal education. They had had really difficult lives because of this. And most of them didn't really know who their fathers were. A few of them had photographs that their mothers had saved of their fathers back in the 1972 kind of thing in their military uniforms. And so I spent 5 days spending time with, I think I probably interviewed 6 or 7 of these people in and around Saigon over this period, and spent time in their houses and talked to them and saw their lives and saw their own families, their wives and kids. And, many of these had actually married people who were similar to themselves just because they'd been stigmatized, and that had brought them together in a way. This was quite a powerful story that I was really wanting to do. But I finished that trip, and then a week later I was on a plane to Romania, and I had some other work that I was finishing up, and then it got put on the back burner a bit, and then suddenly a year had passed and I hadn't done anything with it. And then I talked to a few aspirational publications. I talked to like the Smithsonian and Nat Geo, and it didn't quite fit for them. And then in the end I kind of just let it drop. But I'm quite sad about that. I thought it was a very powerful story that I wanted to tell. Maybe one day I'll go back and do it, because I do think it's something that hasn't been covered, or I've not really read the definitive story on that. I've read a few small pieces about it, but I would like to do a larger piece on that. And I think it's something that is very strong human interest piece that would have quite a wide readership.
Yeah, I think definitely. I mean, for people in the U.S., just the Vietnam War looms so large in a lot of people's minds that, yeah, I think there would definitely be a market for that. All journalists have probably been in a position of, that story they didn't quite get done. Some of those you actually end up remembering better than the stories you do end up doing.
Of course, because you haven't told it. Once you've written a story down, you've almost released it. It's cathartic. It's gone. You've told it. People can find it. Whereas when you haven't actually told the story, then it lingers, I find. And you find yourself retelling it just because it's not been put down on paper.
Right. Yeah. And then onto some stories you did pull off. You can walk us through how you got the idea, how you reported it out. But also I'd be curious how it happened with getting it placed in a publication.
So it's interesting. I was trying to think about what stories I wanted to highlight. More recently, a lot of the stories I've been doing are more spot news stories covering developments, and often they're incremental. So the political situation in Romania, it's something I've covered heavily, especially for the New York Times. It is one story, but it's one story covered in 25 different articles over the last 2 years. But I really love actually doing some of the environmental pieces I've done have been really satisfying satisfying ones to do. I used to do quite a few features for a magazine called Geographical, which is kind of the British version of Nat Geo, you might say. It's the magazine of the Royal Geographical Society, which is people who sent Shackleton around the place, and it's where the explorers of the UK congregate. And I used to do these really long features where I would go off a couple of weeks into very isolated areas. And those are the stories that I really love doing, just because a lot of journalism can be talking to people on the phone, or it's quite limited. So, I'd done a couple that kind of come to mind from those. One was in Vietnam, going into the Mekong Delta area and spending days among the communities that were being affected by rising waters. And, that's a story that many people have done, the effects of global warming, how it's affecting coastal or these regions that rely on certain water levels. But it was still amazing to go down there and spend time. That doesn't exactly answer your question. I've had a few really fortunate experiences where I remember going to the Philippines and in a 10-day period getting kind of 3 really detailed and really fun features, really in-depth features. And one of those accidentally landed on my lap. And that was an incredible trip, because the idea was me and a photographer that I worked with had gone to cover, they're very religious in the Philippines, strongly Catholic. And they have each year in a few towns in the middle of the Philippines, people are voluntarily crucified. They literally have nails hammered into their hands and into their feet, and they're put up on a cross. Now, they don't have, their weight isn't on these wounds, which is obviously the real thing that eventually kills. Well, actually, it's more the starvation that kills, but they are held up by ropes. So they're not having the wounds being pulled on in the same way, but they are properly crucified. And a photographer and myself decided we wanted to go and spend the days leading up to this with the main person, who had been crucified at that point, I think, for 26 years in a row. And he started doing it as penance, I believe, or maybe it was, I think actually he'd fallen sick and he'd said if he gets better, then he will do this for 10 years. And then at the end of 10 years, something else happened. I think he was painting and he fell off a ladder from a 2-story height and then just stood up and was absolutely fine and decided he needed to do it for another 10 years as thanks. And the year we were going, it was supposedly going to be his last year. He decided this was it. And so a lot of journalists, both local and foreign, turn up on the day to take the photos and to get a quote. But we decided to go several days before and spend days with his family and days with him in the lead up to it. It was such an interesting experience seeing the family prepare. His wife wouldn't go and see it. She stayed at home, and when he went off to have it done, one of the kids would go with him, and the kid would run back at the end once he was down safely and would tell the mum, and then she could breathe easy again. And this guy, he had the nails that would be driven into his hands, and he had them sitting on top of his TV for the days before, sitting in medicinal alcohol. And it's his brother-in-law, who's a carpenter, who's the guy who drives them into his hands. So it was really fascinating to start digging into that story and seeing the family connections and seeing how each experienced this and how each saw it. It's one of those stories that I loved doing just because I felt like I got under the skin of the story. It was a story that I'd read for a couple of years, but I'd read the kind of the 500-word version of, on this day, this happens. We went and saw this happening, and here's a couple of quotes. And going there and being able to write 3,500 words and having a photographer doing maybe 12 or so photographs, doing a gallery that went alongside the text, and also having that level of access that meant that when he was being crucified, we were the people standing next to him. It was one of those levels of access and the depth of a story that you only get by going and spending that amount of time with the subjects. And that was a really, really interesting story to do. But at the same time, that same trip, we ended up doing a story about cockfighting in Manila, just because we'd been introduced to a crew of graffiti artists who were friends of friends, and we happened to be in a neighbourhood, and one of their neighbours invited us along, and that ended up turning into a 3,000-word feature just because we went along. And then suddenly we were meeting these people. I was curious about the vet who would take care of the animals that survived afterwards, and the different roles within that quite unpleasant community, but it was still quite an interesting community to see. It was kind of this amazing trip that had those two, and then it had a third story where there's a cemetery where thousands of Filipinos live inside the cemetery, and generations live there, have grown up there, and they live in the mausoleums that have been built for the wealthy, and they sleep on top of the stone sarcophaguses. And so it was one of these trips that was so immersive and so rich in incredible experiences and individuals that really have such different lives, such different passion that I've ever been really aware of.
Wow. Sounds like quite the incredible trip. And among all those stories, which ones were done on spec just without actually having sold them yet? And where did they all appear?
So the crucifixion one was pre-sold. And that went to an Australian publication called the Global Mail, not to be confused with the Globe and Mail.
Sure.
The Global Mail, it was one of these it was one of these publications that came along with a lot of funding and had big aspirations. And it was an online publication that was only doing these long articles. They paid well. It was like $1 a word, some expenses. And they were commissioning things in the kind of 3,000 to 5,000 word range. They existed for, I'm not quite sure, a year and a half, 2 years maybe. And then the backer suddenly had business problems and suddenly lost a lot of money and then stopped backing it, and it quickly went out of business. So I ended up doing maybe 4 or 5 articles for them over a kind of a year period. So that one was pre-sold. And then the cemetery one, I had pre-sold a feature to this geographical magazine. But at the same time, the Toronto Star was interested in a shorter piece on that. So I ended up doing that article for a few different publications in very different ways with different subjects and quotes. And then the cockfighting one just was complete accident. It was one of those that hadn't been on our radar, hadn't been something we'd planned to do. And then that ended up being a magazine feature. I think even the cover story in the South China Morning Post's weekend magazine. And then on top of that, there were a few other articles that came out from that trip. So it's a 10, 11-day trip that was both very interesting and also quite profitable.
That's good. And the other thing I was just going to say is that there's this great book by an NPR correspondent in the Philippines. It was probably in the 90s, called Dead Season, where he looks at cockfighting and it's kind of juxtaposed with the death squads. It's an extremely gruesome book, but I would definitely recommend it to a lot of people.
They're up for quite grim read.
It's really great descriptions, storytelling, really get a feel of what it's like in some of these places in the Philippines, which isn't always very pleasant. And I'll try to get links to some of those stories from you. I assume the one for the Australian publication might not be out there anymore since it folded,
yeah,
right?
that's unfortunately disappeared. The website vanished. But the other 2 should be somewhere in the ethers of the internet.
Sure. And yeah, I'm trying to think of another publication that had Global Post, maybe it was called.
The Global Post, I also worked for them, and they've also gone under yet.
Oh, okay. I was wondering.
That's the thing about freelancing. Like every year I lose a couple of publications that either cease to exist or their freelance budgets have disappeared. But thankfully, I normally pick up a couple as well. But it's interesting. As a freelancer, you get a real sense of the media landscape as it changes, because you see how the freelance budgets come and go, or how publications shrink their foreign staff and actually suddenly have a bit more money for freelancers. And then, obviously some publications just completely vanish almost overnight, and publications that were at one point giving you kind of an article a month, and suddenly you need to replace that with something else.
Out of curiosity, what would be a new publication that's come around? Or is it just that they're new to you?
I mean, most of them I would say are new to me. I'm trying to think of new publications that have appeared. You have good things like, The Atlantic right now is really pushing and expanding their foreign coverage, which is really exciting, both as someone who reads a lot of world news, but also as someone who greatly appreciates publications that are spending money on foreign reporting and foreign stories. That's great to see right now. They took someone from the New York Times over who's heading that up. They're expanding their foreign staff, and they're also suddenly using a lot more freelancers. And so that's obviously not a new publication, but they're a publication that's suddenly investing a lot more in foreign reporting, which is, great to see.
I guess the next step is the lightning round. So if you're ready, the first question is, as a freelancer, I guess I'd be curious if you wake up in the morning and if you have some sort of routine, either how you check the news or how you start your days as a freelancer.
Because I follow quite a few different countries, and because I'm following certain events, I actually use Feedly quite a bit. So I have kind of news alerts that come in on various things. So I have lots of different technologies in place that make sure I don't miss important stories, just because I'm trying to keep an eye on stories in 7 or 8 different countries. And it's not always the easiest. You don't want to have to go constantly to newspapers in each of those different countries to try and find the stories. And some of those countries countries. I obviously don't speak the language, so I'm relying on English language sources or Google Translate to keep up to date before going there and obviously having assistance. I have various things that help me keep abreast of stuff and help me follow important news stories until I feel it's time to cover them.
Gotcha. So you wake up and see what's rolled in on all of these things.
Wake up, check my emails, check any messages I've received on various platforms, check the football scores and what's been happening in Trump world overnight, and then, get down to properly scouring what's happening in the regions I follow before trying to then shut all that off and actually focus on writing and not be too distracted.
Right. What is a must-read publication that you look at almost every day?
The Guardian, the New York Times, and the Economist are the ones that I go on every day. I rely on those heavily. I trust them. I do read a lot of other publications, but those are ones that I go on, every day.
And then what is a publication you read, listen to, or watch just for fun?
I mean, the New Yorker, the writing's incredible and the types of stories are wonderful. And I devour podcasts as well. So I'm not someone who does silence. So if I'm walking, even just to buy some milk, it doesn't matter what I'm doing. I have something in my ear. So I constantly have podcasts on, some American, lots of British ones, lots of BBC ones.
Cool. I'm always looking for new podcasts. Do you have any particular one you could shout out?
I'm a big fan of the BBC one. So there's something called In Our Time, which is an hour. It picks a person or event in history and has academics on to discuss it in a very enlightened way. Obviously, listen to long form. I listen to Desert Island Discs, which pretty much any Brit will know what that is. But for Americans, again, it's like a 45-minute show where a celebrity, they're brought on, they discuss their life. But the concept of the show is they're cast away on a desert island and they have to pick 8 songs that they can take with them and 1 book, and that's it, and a luxury item. So it's a show that's been going on for decades, and they've had pretty much every famous person you can think of almost over the years on it. And they have all their archives, so you can literally find thousands of episodes of it and listen to Bill Clinton in early 2000s, or you can listen to just anyone. It's quite fascinating.
What is the best journalistic piece, article, whatever you have consumed recently?
I'm going to cheat slightly and pick a book, just because I'm just about to finish a non-fiction book by a Bulgarian writer called Katka Kasabova. It's called Border, and it's basically a non-fiction kind of journey along the border between Bulgaria and Turkey, which is the border on the edge of the EU, on the edge of Europe. In the 70s and 80s, like the Berlin Wall, it was the border between the East and the West, if you will, between the communist bloc. And she was someone who grew up in Bulgaria in the 80s and spent time on that side of the border. And it's very interesting visiting these communities there now and using some of her past recollections and discussing. She's a beautiful writer, for one, but it's also very powerful looking at the different sides of the borders and how the relationship is and how borders affect your life. And obviously that's an important subject right now anyway. I haven't read much about this border, and I found it quite fascinating to see it tackled in this way. And it's a beautiful book. It won some awards. It came out in, I think, 2017, so it's like 2 years old, but I've just finished it.
Sounds great. It's called The Border by who?
It's called Border, A Journey to the Edge of Europe, and it's by Katka Kasabova.
Cool. Is there any particular subject matter you read into specifically that isn't related to your job?
I read a lot of football writing and sports writing in general. I find good sports writing is really a craft, and it's really quite beautiful. And for an expat, if you will, or for a foreign correspondent, you need these certain things that maybe tie you a little bit to back home. And for me, that's, as you would call it, soccer. It's English football. And so for me, I do check to see what's happening in the football back in the UK, and I followed it in the various countries I've lived in as well.
Is there a particular team you support back home?
Everton, which is a team in Liverpool.
Okay.
They're middling. They never win anything, and they don't lose too badly either.
Did you pick them because... No, you obviously didn't pick them because you're not from around Liverpool, are you? How did that happen?
It was the first live game I ever got taken to. I went up to London with a family friend, and they were playing against Arsenal, and, I picked a team, basically, and I picked the ones wearing blue rather than ones wearing red, and it stuck. As a kid, it's a very arbitrary decision, and then it becomes a very emotional thing over time.
I've gotten deeper and deeper into American football. It is directly linked to not being around home and, just having some sort of anchor here, but like...
It's a nice connection. And when I first moved abroad, I liked knowing that my university friends, I knew that they would be watching the same game as me. Time zone away, I'd be on a Sunday night at 11 p.m. watching a football game in a bar in Saigon, knowing that half a world away, many of my friends would be watching the same game. It was a nice little anchor to home, as you said.
On to yes or no questions. The first one is Glenn Greenwald, yes or no?
Yes. Yeah, because I think there are some people, journalists, who I disagree. I'm not saying with him, but there are some I obviously disagree with their take on things. But I think journalists should be digging into things. I think they should be investigating difficult things. And I think he does an important job of finding things out and bringing them into the light. So, yes.
Cool. And then this one's particularly interesting to ask freelancers, I find. Vice Media, yes or no?
So I've never worked for them. At the beginning, when they were starting doing video, I remember having a beer with one of their video guys in Beijing who was trying to bring me on board to do stuff. But at that time, their rates were not high and they're still not high. So I didn't take him up on the offer. Some of their work I've enjoyed, but a lot of it is quite sensationalized. And so I don't have a strong opinion. You know, I hear all the criticisms, but haven't experienced that personally and don't know others who have.
And then it depends if you've seen it. The Wire season 5, yes or no?
Yes. I mean, all of The Wire is amazing. Season 2, I wasn't a big fan of, but The Wire is just amazing on so many levels. And I get why you bring it up because of the journalistic ethical issues there, but just a great program.
Yeah, I think season 5 is great in terms of the vibe of the newsroom. And also it's just very entertaining whether or not you want to get into could something like that happen. If you had to trade places with one journalist, living or dead, and you would have their career, who would it be?
There's not a specific journalist that I want to flag, but for me, I was always fascinated by the Vietnam War, and that's always been something that, if I'm picturing myself, every journalist has had the fantasies of being a war correspondent, even if most of us would do really bad at it in real life. And so for me, those that covered the Vietnam War, that were there in Saigon in the late 60s, early 70s, and I know it's wrong, and I know the romantic images in my mind are not accurate, and it was so many people suffering, but there's a part of me that still would have loved to have been there trying to cover that war.
Sure, that's a good answer. I mean, switching places with one of them, certainly. What is one thing you wish you could travel back and tell your younger self?
To take a pause when I arrive in new countries or new places and learn the language properly right from the word go, and just not leap right into feeling a need to straight away do lots of stories. When I first arrived in China, and again when I first arrived in Romania, I arrive and I feel like straight away I need to be doing a huge amount of work rather than just taking a breath, taking 3 months, 6 months to study the language properly and really get that down, and only then get into the writing part. I feel I'm too impatient, and I would just tell myself to take that pause.
Sure. Do you speak Romanian now, out of curiosity? I imagine some.
Some, yes. I can watch the news in it and read the news in it, and I make a lot of grammatical mistakes, and my speech is not as good as I would like it to be. And perhaps if I'd spent the first 6 months going to language lessons rather than doing occasional weeks of study here and there when I had the time in amongst other work, I wouldn't have so many gaps.
Sure. Yeah, speaking is my weakest part in Portuguese, definitely. But luckily, it's perhaps not the most important point of journalism. It's, listening is far more important than reading. And yeah,
It is. But I would like to speak better Romanian. I still think I've treated it as secondary compared to the work. And I think realistically, if you're planning to spend significant time in a country, it should be the first thing, the priority at the beginning.
Sure. Do you think you'll jump countries again anytime soon?
It's not on the agenda. There's nowhere specific that we're planning to move to. If the opportunity arises, it's not off the cards, but it's not a short-term goal.
What is your favorite book, TV, or other media property about journalists, and why?
So if no one said this yet, I'll be a bit sad. Has anyone said Evelyn Waugh's Scoop yet?
Oh, yeah.
Evelyn Waugh's Scoop
so,
is just the best book about journalism, especially foreign correspondency, ever. It's just a beautiful piece of satire. It's such a pastiche on being a foreign correspondent, and it's just such a great book. Whatever it's like 70 years old now, it's still one of the best things ever written about foreign correspondence work. So yeah, no, hands down. Evelyn Waugh's Scoop.
Now that I think about it, my guess is Singaporean journalist Ko Guai Ching picked that as hers. But I've got to go back and read it. I mean, it's a mainstay, everybody says, even the ones who don't pick it. And then the final question. Qualifications aside, if you couldn't be a journalist, what job would you do?
I mean, as I said near the beginning, there was always a part of me that was also very interested in aid work. And so I think if I could do something outside of journalism, I've always been interested in maybe working for Médecins Sans Frontières, not in a medical capacity, but maybe being like on the ground emergency response person, someone who, when a volcano earthquake happens, who deals with getting resources there, deals with the management on the ground, deals with getting everything set up to help as many people as possible. And so I know that's incredibly difficult job, but I think that would be something that, as you said, qualifications aside, that would really appeal to me.
Sure, yeah. It gets back to maybe that first Sri Lanka experience. Okay. So that's all my questions. Anything else you think is important to note?
No, don't think so. I think that was well covered. I'm not sure how you're going to cut that down, but good luck with that.
I always find a way. But anyway, thanks so much for doing this. I've been speaking to Kit Gillet, a freelancer in Romania.
Thanks for having me on.
That's our show. Thanks for listening to my conversation with Kit Gillet, a freelancer in Romania. I'll post links to some of Kit's work and other things we talked about in the podcast description and also on our show page, foreignpod.podbean.com. If you like the show, please subscribe to it in Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Spotify, YouTube, or wherever you get your podcasts, and leave a 5-star review. Beyond that, it would be a huge help if you also write out a positive review saying what you like about the podcast. You can find us on Twitter at @foreignpod or tweet about us with the hashtag #foreignpod. On Facebook, our page is facebook.com/foreignpod. Above all, if you know someone who might like the podcast, please recommend it to them. The show is produced and edited by me. Our music is a track called Love Chances by Mackay Beats. There's more information on that in the podcast description and on our show page. Please look for the next episode to be posted sometime in early January. I'll put the exact date on our Twitter and Facebook pages in the weeks to come. Until then, I'm Jake Spring, and this is Foreign Correspondence.